Hi, this is John Romano, and I'm recording this lecture for my course on medieval history, and its title is France, Strengthened Monarchy and Cultural Achievements. And I should say that these two topics are somewhat loosely connected, and at least for some of the examples of cultural achievements, I'll venture slightly outside of France. When last in this course we had spoken about the French monarchy, we had said after the period of feudalism or lordship, we said that in fact the French monarchy was in a grave situation. And in fact, the king ended up having very little power to be able to discipline his own nobles. And what you saw instead was a series of great feudal states within France, which really operated independently of the monarchy. And strange as it may sound to our ears, the king had actually had fewer lands and fewer resources than many of his great vassals. And we think that the feudal princes of France differed greatly in the kind of power that they were able to have, but most of them were stronger, and none of them were weaker than the tiny little duchy that was under the control of the king, which is the area essentially right around Paris. And the future history of the medieval French monarchy was essentially one of rebuilding royal power from these very humble origins to something that was much more imposing and much more in line with the future of Europe. The king who helped to begin to turn around this situation is pictured here, known as Louis VI. You may not know it from this particular image, but Louis was a mountain of a man, and he, in spite of that, though, he showed this kind of restless and unflagging energy. To show just how far Louis had to climb, the initial task he had to do was one of essentially reducing the various lords who were around Paris, who were encroaching upon royal land, and they had to be defeated before he really could do much of anything else. So this should tell you that the reassertion of power of the French monarchy was a long, slow, and painful struggle. Louis, however, was able and determined, and he benefited from a very close relationship and the support of the church. And we do think that, as a rule of thumb, the church tended to want to have fewer rulers and to negotiate more with monarchs. And we know that the clergy would help Louis VI to be able to build up his administration and his bureaucracy. Louis VI, in time, here's his seal, would end up coming up with a very regular procedure to discipline his vassals, which in essence were many of the nobles of France. He would summon the lord in particular he wanted to target to the monarch's court to answer for some act of violence, which was not really very difficult because, as we said, these lords, their major occupation was violence. Once this noble would be condemned in the king's court, we know that the noble would defy the king as soon as he reached home. He would be foolish not to. And then he ended up breaking into open revolt. At this point, Louis was able then to draw upon his close relationship with the church and excommunicate the noble. And then, after that point, he had perfect justification to march against this lord and seize his land. And this first procedure was used with nobles that were very close to Paris, so very close to noble territory. And in essence, Louis, through these means, managed to make them all submit to his will. Then he also begins to replicate the same process with lords slightly outside of his region, so beginning to creep into more territory. After the death of Louis VI, his son Louis VII would then take power. And Louis VII was in some ways, he's shown here, again with some members of the church, also his allies. Part of Louis VII's, his assertion of power and his ability to gain new territory for the monarchy came not only with disciplining vassals, but also through marriage. And Louis VII actually ends up getting married to Eleanor of Aquitaine. And by doing so, he actually brought the vast amount of territory, Aquitaine, southwestern France, into the hands of the French king. It is unfortunate, however, that Louis VII really seemed to have been personally incompatible with Eleanor, who found him gloomy and distant. And we know that Eleanor, shown here in her sarcophagus, was someone who was imbued with the cult of courtly love that was circulating at the time. And in fact, all sorts of whispers were heard around her that she was someone who was personally sexually promiscuous. And in fact, there were rumors going around that Eleanor had actually even had sex with her own uncle when on crusade, no less. In any case, Eleanor would bear Louis VII two daughters, but no son. And eventually, the disagreement between the two grew to such a degree that they just actually end up agreeing on a separation. And because of the good relations between the French monarchy and the church, they granted them an annulment on the terms of consanguinity, i.e., they were too closely related. This, of course, was true even when the marriage had initially started, and would have been true for many nobles generally, but in this case, it was a convenient pretext to bring an end to this unhappy wedding. And Louis would then end up getting married 2 other times, and eventually he would end up getting male heirs. We see Louis following the exact same kinds of policies that would allow his father to increase the territory under the control of the king. But we also see Louis trying to even up the prestige of the monarchy by, for instance, attacking those who he viewed to be predatory lords who took land from the church, which won him even more goodwill from the clergy. The roadblock, we think, that Louis VII runs into is that one of the primary adversaries and one of the other monarchs who held a great deal of land in France was none other than the English. And we, of course, now think of France and England as being 2 very different countries. That was not true, however, in a good portion of the Middle Ages. And in fact, the English, for a long time, would hold on to, for instance, important territories like Normandy and Aquitaine, which had reverted to the hands of the English after Eleanor had gotten married into the English royal family. This situation, this state, of which the English held on to so much in France, would be recognized by the next king, by Philip II Augustus. And he really makes a serious attempt to be able to reverse this situation, and really, I should say, with success. I realize that this map is in French, but if you look in particular under the red territory at 1180, you'll see that these are all areas that were under the control of the King of England. You'll see by the time Philip Augustus's reign is over in 1223, how that red splotch has gotten so much smaller as a result of his actions. Philip II Augustus would aid the revolts of English nobles, and in essence have these people rebel against their lord. In effect, by essentially cozying up to some of these people, these English lords who held territory, he actually ended up winning them over to his side. And he was not above using bribery at times to do this. Philip II Augustus would also hire mercenary troops to be able to help him carry out his battles. We really see him beginning to go to a process of especially attacking many of the territories in northern France, the territories of Normandy. He would slowly capture them, these English fortresses, one by one in Normandy. And finally, these conquests would be sealed off by the Battle of Bouvines, a manuscript illumination of which is shown here. Which in this battle, Philip II Augustus defeated both the forces of England and a force from the Holy Roman Empire. And in fact, this was a very successful battle for the French monarchy, in which they crushed their opposition. We also see that Philip II Augustus will also attack on new territories through marriage as well. And the entire process during his reign meant that the French king then would be the master of more land than any other vassal. So he's swinging away the tide and making sure now the French king is in control of France. There was one territory, though, that even after all of these battles, that was really stubbornly outside the control of the French kings, and that really was southern France. We think that in many cases these lords who had lived in southern France were distant enough from the king that they barely even pretended to recognize his authority. The one thing that ends up changing this situation is the power struggle, the crusade, really, that we had spoken about earlier. One of those crusades that was internal to Europe and against those viewed as religious enemies. The crusade against the heretical group known as the Cathars, or as we refer to them in the modern world as Cathars. Now, we've already spoken about the importance of this crusade for the movement of crusading as a whole. But what's important in this respect is that this crusade was so bloody, and in fact, it actually aimed at so many of the powerful lords and nobles in France that, in fact, it actually leads to a power vacuum in southern France. That people who previously would have stood up to the king were dead as the result of the crusade. And you can imagine then what luck it was, really, for the French king then to sweep in and to fill that gap and to begin to assert his power again over the territories of southern France. By far the most enormously respected French king who ever lived is pictured here. This is Louis IX, who really, as opposed to the vast majority of kings, not only was viewed with respect, but was actually later on, upon his death, was seen as a saint. And trust me, most of the kings who we study in medieval history don't even approximate that ideal. and really contemporaries just fall over themselves to praise him for all of his characteristics. Louis IX was brave, he was generous, he was deeply pious. He was also just in the administration of government. After hearing complaints about extortions and injustice of royal officials, he actually would punish them. He did not tolerate abuses. As you can see here from this image, he also would do penance himself whenever he felt he needed to. Louis IX ended up sending out all sorts of traveling legal representatives who did investigations for him. For instance, looking at the conduct of local officials, redressing the grievances of his subjects. And any sort of appeals that these traveling ministers could not handle, he would hear at his own court. And in fact, it really is Louis IX who establishes a permanent royal court in Paris and a permanent staff of lawyers there. Altogether, too, we think that although Louis, in some sense, who's pictured here in front of the Pope, although he detested the kind of warfare that would take place among nobles in France, and this kind of private warfare, and he really made an attempt to bring an end to all of this sort of what he felt to be chaotic war. We do think that he did not hate all wars. It's a question of which war. And in fact, he had no problem with crusading. He just going against those who were outside of the European context. But we really do think that after this point, really all of this sort of constant feudal warfare that had really racked France for a long time is going to begin to get quite limited as a result of the monarchy's new power. And in fact, he also, we're going to see now that Louis IX will summon representatives of the church, the nobility, and towns to help to enforce his legislation, to agree to taxation, and to rally support for the king. So to really to bring everyone together under him. As for crusading, in his own time, crusading would be seen as a meritorious act. And in fact, although Louis IX's crusades are going to prove to be enormous failures, they're still going to actually help to burnish his reputation even further. We see that after Friedrich II's strange crusade that we talked about while he was excommunicated, Jerusalem had been retaken by Turks who were allied with the Sultan or ruler of Egypt. And Louis IX wanted to reverse this situation, and he pledged a crusade and collected a great army to be able to strike at Egypt, which really had become the center of Muslim power. And initially he will be successful at taking Damietta, shown here, and he started then to march to the delta of the Nile. But then his soldiers ended up becoming hopelessly confused, unsure what branch of the river to follow. And in fact, the Egyptians will actually open up the floodgates, quite literally, to end up even furthering destroying the situation of the French soldiers. And then they would be finished off by Egyptian soldiers. And you can see here just, again, one of the manuscript illuminations that give you some idea of how many of his soldiers died as this result. Louis then would be captured, ransomed off, and would go back to Europe, having accomplished very little. And later after this, Louis IX would actually launch another crusade, which amazingly accomplished even less. and after he landed, Louis IX would die soon afterwards, and his body would then be preserved for relics to be venerated. But without his leadership, it really ends up in complete failure. And here's just one small piece that's left over from Louis IX's relics, even after the ravages of the French Revolution. Now, I mentioned earlier, though, I wanted, as the course of this lecture, to talk about some of the cultural achievements, especially ones from France in this period, but ones that really begin to affect Western Europe a little more generally. Bear in mind, I have to go rapid fire through several different accomplishments, but better to go through them quickly than not to handle them at all in this course. One of the things that we see that really is part of the cultural life in Western Europe, especially starting again in the 12th century, is the production of manuscripts. This is, again, manuscripts are nothing other than the skins of animals, especially cattle and sheep. The skins have to be treated with this special solution that has lye in it, among other things, to be able to get the hair off. The skins have to be stretched so they become pliable enough to be able to write on, and they have to be cut. And then finally, they have to be sewn together to form a manuscript. We have all sorts of manuscripts from the 12th, 13th, and even beyond that in the Middle Ages. The ones that people, of course, spend the majority of time thinking about are those ones that are illuminated. Although I should say that the vast majority of manuscripts do not receive illuminations, and in fact are far dingier and harder to read than some of these kind of beautiful examples that we spend a lot of time looking at in museums or online now. So just to give you one idea, this is one of the most famous manuscripts ever produced. Some of the images in it, especially some of the most famous ones dealing with the lives of late medieval nobles in France. Riding out, hunting, for instance. And again, with really just these sort of beautiful, rich colors. Here's dogs descending on a boar. Here is an example of a banquet held by one lord. See how lush this manuscript is. Keeping pigs, and sometimes agricultural scenes as well. Another of the major cultural trends that becomes important in this period is known as Scholasticism. Now, I had mentioned to you earlier that universities are going to become a very important feature of Europe in this period. But we haven't said too much about what intellectual style was current at the time, what movement. And really, scholasticism is the movement that becomes philosophically most important. Many of the thinkers who engage in this school are constantly thinking about the very difficult question about what is the relationship between reason and revelation. How can the two be made to work in one intellectual system? These philosophers in some ways tackle very difficult issues. I mean, very broad ones, like, what is the nature of a human being? What is the purpose of human life? Can you prove the existence of God? What are the attributes of God? What is the relationship between God and humans like? One of the most famous debates that becomes current at the time is the debate on what is known as universals versus the particulars. Are individual things and somehow an imperfect reflection of an ideal thing? Do universals have a reality? So is there a reality to the ideal dog as opposed to a specific dog that one could point out? What's so interesting about the method of scholasticism is that it really privileges discussion and debate. And some of the teachers in this period wrote textbooks that pulled out what appeared to be contradictory passages from authoritative works, whether it be the Bible or other works of ancient Christian learning. But of course, everybody knows that there can be no contradiction in truth. And so it was up to you, your job as a student in contact with your professors, to come up with a way where these two passages could coexist in the same intellectual universe. And sometimes this could really lead to daring questions. I mean, everyone at the time believed that God exists, but the question came, could you demonstrate that logically? Could there be an evil God? A question that maybe appears sacrilegious. These sort of questions were asked. As part of scholasticism, one of the linchpins of all of this discussion and debate was the rediscovery of the ancient Greek thinker known as Aristotle, shown in a medieval image here on the right. And Aristotle actually comes back into Western Europe via the Muslim world. And in fact, it often comes attached with commentaries by some of the great Muslim philosophers of a previous age. And what Aristotle really provides for people of the time is a very clear understanding of the physical world. Aristotle differentiates very clearly, for instance, between what is nature and what is the heavens. Aristotle writes about, for instance, things about motion and matter. He analyzes the study of ethics and virtue. All of these subjects were things that excited medieval intellectuals at this period. If there is a criticism that is sometimes made of people's use of Aristotle during this time period, very often it appeared to people that scholars in this period did not so much challenge Aristotle as pass down his knowledge. So authoritative did he become that Aristotle is sometimes in sources simply referred to as the philosopher. So some of the ideas of Aristotle would really pass into daily intellectual life in Western Europe at this time. The four elements, for instance, that the earth is a sphere, but it is at the center of the universe. That heavenly bodies, everything you see in the sky, are fixed in crystalline spheres. All these are ideas that come directly from Aristotle and really are repeated for even beyond the Middle Ages. We also seem to see that people would use this idea that Aristotle have that there was a prime mover that had set basic motion into the universe, into the moving of heavenly spheres in the heavens. And both Muslim and Christian philosophers would actually give a name to that prime mover and say, in fact, that you could equate it with God himself. So this is one way in which Aristotle could in some ways be modified to meet a monotheistic universe. With that being said, however, there was a lot in Aristotle that really was subject to controversy. Aristotle taught, for instance, that the world was not created. It was eternal, which seemed to fly in the face of the account in Genesis. Aristotle seemed to think the soul was not eternal, but finite as well. Again, something that a good Christian could not accept. And it seemed that Aristotle basically posited a deterministic kind of universe. Some of these few ideas that Aristotle had that were extremely controversial would end up spoiling Aristotle for some thinkers who said that really Aristotle was a representative of pagan thought, and we just had to throw it out entirely. Other scholars said, well, perhaps what we have to do is accept some sort of what they refer to as a double truth, that you could get a truth from philosophy and theology that could both be contradictory, but in some way both could be true. Then there were also those who accepted much of Aristotle, but then ended up actually arguing with him by rational philosophy whenever he conflicted with Christian ideas. So who really, in some degree, felt that you could save the best parts of Aristotle without throwing him entirely out. Another area in which we see cultural development in this time period is in literature. During this time period, we begin to see increasingly vernacular compositions. So all sorts of works of literature that were written in the common tongue, not in Latin, which still was the common intellectual movement. So we see, for instance, all sorts of what they refer to as romances. Romance is the term coming from Romance languages, i.e. not Latin. And a lot of these are often safely set in a time before people live now. They're set in the ancient world, perhaps to remove them from the connotation that this is the way people should be behaving today. At least one primary example of this new kind of literature that becomes extremely important, and one that you've almost certainly heard of before, are the stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. I won't go at length here because hopefully in some context you've read some of these, but of course Arthur is known as being this sort of this prime exemplar of how you behave in a chivalric manner. People love these stories of war, of jousting, of how appropriately to woo women. We already seen the Crusades that the knight was viewed as someone who was sacralized, and we see this idea here too, that these knights could be fighting for the appropriate things within Christianity. Searching, for instance, most famously for the Holy Grail, the supposed chalice that Jesus had used at the Last Supper. And the only controversial point here was that sometimes within the context of these stories, there were sinful acts depicted, like, for instance, adultery or deception of one's partner. The women, inevitably, in most of these romances, including Arthur, tended to be charming, beautiful, and totally inaccessible. It may be strange to us is that many of these knights were doing all these great deeds in literature to gain the favor of ladies, but not necessarily to have any sexual relationship with them. In fact, sex was not the point. They were supposed to show just how masterful they were on the battlefield, show their worth as people, their gentleness, but it really, in some ways, sexual behavior in these contexts was often seen as somewhat bestial. It brought people closer to animals, and really, that was not something that human beings necessarily would have to do. Along the lines of talking about literature, too, I should mention that drama actually begins to make a comeback after a long absence in at least in a regularized way in Western Europe. And in fact, we see in some cases, initially people would actually incorporate small dramas into liturgies. So, for instance, one famous example was the scene is where the three Marys discovered the empty tomb on Easter Day. And then we see that dramas increasingly begin to grow outside of churches, sometimes going to the open spaces around them, and often will handle all sorts of biblical themes. Above all else, the Passion of Jesus. And in time, many clergymen felt that these kinds of dramas were not at all immoral, quite the opposite. They were used for faith, and in fact, they could help give a basic biblical knowledge to people who could not gain it otherwise. And so working really in tandem, for instance, with the kind of images that you may see in church to be able to teach people about the faith. Another area that becomes extremely important, and certainly one of the areas in which we still have a physical contact with the people in this period, is the developments in architecture and the building of new churches that occurs during this period. When the period we're talking about today starts, we begin to see the development of what is known as the Romanesque style of building. And one of the primary sort of new architectural developments that emerges from this period is getting rid of the flat wooden roofs that were used by basilicas, by large churches. And really, in essence, this was a style that had been used in ancient Rome still. And now people instead begin to adopt round stone vaults in church building. And again, these vaults can take slightly different form. Some of them, for instance, the barrel vault shown here. Others can take what is known as the groan vaults shown here. The stone roofs now that would be constructed instead of wood ones were extremely heavy, and they really required massive walls and piers to be able to support them. And this often led to squat little churches that could be somewhat gloomy at some points, and often very narrow spaces for windows. Although, again, people at the time were not necessarily unhappy about this. They would say, in fact, there was an air of, first of all, solidity about these buildings, but also this sort of partially obscured spaces could be spaces of mystery. And really, we see in the remaining examples, the Romanesque that we have, all sorts of ornamental sculpture that is done. To give you some example of just one church, this is the French church of Soleil, which uses the Romanesque style. Here is its facade. And you get a very good sense of what the Romanesque looks, this sort of squat structure with the vaults very clearly outlined here. Here's another example. And just to give you some idea of this sort of ornamental sculpture, this is the famous tympanum, or the sculpture that appears above the door here in the Church of Soleil. It's a unique kind of example of a sculpture because it appears to be that we have Jesus here simultaneously at at the Pentecost, and seemingly also sending out his apostles simultaneously. And really, they begin to go out to then all the different areas of the world that are delineated around here. And if you look very close, you'll see these are the dog-headed people that presumably also are going to be evangelized. The second major architectural style that comes during this period is known as the Gothic. And in fact, it becomes far more famous, and really there's a lot more examples of Gothic architecture that are still around. And the person who is more responsible for the Gothic style than anyone else is this fellow pictured here, known as Suger. And he was an abbot of the Church of Saint-Denis, a church that traditionally had very strong links to the French monarchy. And to give you some idea of just how enormously powerful Suger was, when Louis VII goes on crusade, it is in essence Suger who takes over the entire reign and rules while he's gone. And we really think that it is Suger who finds a way then to rebuild churches in such a way that these churches become a new kind of spiritual center of France. Just to give you some idea of the architectural changes involved in the Gothic, what we see here are these kind of ribbed vault that end up becoming very important for the Gothic style. Pointed arches, such as those that are pictured here, and what are known as flying buttresses that are going outside the actual building of the church. And altogether, what these three things do, the rib vault, the pointed arches, and the flying buttresses, is they first of all lighten the load of the ceiling, so it didn't have to be quite as thick as in the Romanesque style. And they also end up deflecting the weight of the roof onto thinner support columns. The support columns do not have to be quite so heavy and squat as they were previously. The end result of this are churches that are far taller than any churches had previously been in Western Europe, that end up having slender walls that then have all sorts of extra room created, and the room that is created is given over then to windows, and through the windows, of course, it allowed for far more light to pour into the spaces. And Suger, in effect, really, we know so much about his creation of this style because he actually writes a lot about it, about how to create a new church in this fashion, how to organize labor. He got his hands dirty with this project. And how, in some ways, this was both a technical achievement, just building a church is this huge, but we think that someone like Suger also suggested that it is really, this was a great victory for spirituality too. He wrote, for instance, about the spiritual importance of light, and really made it seem, again, this sort of light that poured in during worship was almost something akin to mysticism. One of the most famous French churches that is built in this style that really preserves a lot of its original ornamentation is known as Chartres, and it's not very far away from Paris. Here's what it looks like as a whole as a church. Again, you can really see here very clearly these architectural features, but also how huge the walls become, how tall the building is as a whole, and how many windows it ends up having. These windows, of course, known for the somewhat misleading modern term of stained glass. These are the flying buttresses, of course, on the outside. You can see here, again, one of the motifs that really strikes up a lot is this idea of Christ in majesty. And you can see, of course, all the 4 symbols of the Gospels around Jesus here. And on the whole, I should also call your attention to that in Gothic, the sculpture often takes a far more lifelike kind of feel to it than the sculpture had been in previous styles. Here again is some of the stained glass within Chartres. Some of it's so far up that it was hard to believe that anyone really could have seen it all that well at the time. Here again is another doorway into Chartres. You can notice that there was nothing sacrilegious about the horoscope. They actually have some of this sculpture relates to the sort of astrological signs. Here's a very interesting one too. This is meant to be the coronation of Mary as the Queen of Heaven. You can see the Dormition of Mary below. And here's just some of the great examples of the beautiful stained glass. Hard to see in this example, I realize. And here's just one example, a little up close. This is one of the most famous images of stained glass from Chartres, which of course shows the Virgin Mary and Jesus on her lap. The last field in which we see cultural developments in this time is in science. And we really see increasingly in this time the development of what we might refer to as clinical medicine. Increasingly, people begin now to take people's pulse, examine urine and feces, to take temperature, to look at the coloration of people's skin, to be able to figure out health. And we really see all sorts of discussion about what is the appropriate way of life, what sort of diet people should eat, exercise, how much should they bathe, these kinds of things. Also a question about what sort of medicines increasingly was something that some intellectuals begin to be curious about. And of course, really some of the practice of medicine involves things that may be distasteful to us today. Bloodletting was still seen as something that was positive. And although, again, in some cases at least, people would feel that the best healing is natural. At the time, as opposed to doctors, most childbirth was simply given over to midwives, not even something that was really something that doctors came into contact with. And certain ideas that had come across from the Greek world about, for instance, the theory of the 4 humors is still really well represented and popular at this time. The need to keep a balance among these 4. With all that being said, we also see some of the intellectual underpinnings of modern science at this time. And in particular, for instance, Robert Grosseteste, pictured here at Oxford, is both an intellectual scholar and a bishop, who begins to teach, for instance, that it is necessary to learn things through first-hand knowledge, through observations. This theory applies to biblical study. He feels that you have to learn the original language of biblical works to understand them, but also with natural phenomena. He felt that, for instance, you had to look at the world around you to learn about it. We see, for instance, that Grosseteste becomes interested, for instance, in optics. He discusses optics in such a way that he can feel that he can actually learn something about the nature of the universe just by gaining some insight into sight, if you will. Another example of this intellectuals dealing in science in this point was this man here. known as William of Occam. William of Occam taught that God was transcendent and omnipotent and therefore above humanity. Really, in some ways, that meant that the only way to find out about God was through revelation. When it came to our world, the observable world, however, the only thing we should be using to be able to learn about it is reason. And in fact, reason can teach us all sort of things about the world of our experience, the phenomenal world, and about its regular operation. Again, you can just learn about this through careful observation. Of course, all bets were off once God intervenes in the world. But at least for most processes, you didn't necessarily need to always refer to revelation to understand them. All right, that's it. Thank you. Bye-bye.